The HOA notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on stiff paper with an official-looking stamp, the kind of document that usually meant trouble. Jake almost tossed it in the junk pile, assuming it was another useless HOA newsletter about lawn maintenance or mailbox regulation. But then, as he skimmed the first few lines, his coffee nearly slipped from his fingers. "Dear homeowner," it read, "as per HOA regulations, all dogs exceeding 20 pounds are hereby prohibited from residing within the community. Compliance is mandatory, effective immediately." His heart pounded as he reread it, hoping he had misunderstood. But there it was, in black and white. His beloved golden retriever, Max, was being outlawed. For a few seconds, he just stood there, stunned. Max sat at his feet, oblivious, wagging his tail. The absurdity of the situation hit Jake all at once. He had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. Max had been with him for 4. They had never caused a single problem. The idea that his dog, his best friend, was suddenly banned because of some arbitrary weight limit was beyond ridiculous. And worst of all, he knew exactly who was behind it. Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman with an uncanny ability to turn even the smallest rule violation into a full-scale scandal. She had made headlines in the community Facebook group for policing trash bin placements and measuring the height of people's grass with a ruler. It was no secret that she thrived on controlling every aspect of the neighborhood. And now, apparently, she had set her sights on pets. Jake stormed out onto his porch, half expecting to see Karen lurking nearby, waiting to witness his reaction. Sure enough, there she was, watering her perfectly manicured front lawn, a smug expression already creeping across her face. She didn't even wait for him to say anything. "Oh, Jake," she called sweetly, setting down her watering can. "I assume you got the notice?" Jake clenched his jaw. "You can't be serious, Karen," she gasped, feigning innocence. "I don't make the rules, Jake. The HOA board does. And we all agreed that large dogs just aren't appropriate for our community anymore. They can be a nuisance, barking, shedding, taking up space." He gestured toward her oversized poodle, which was lounging on her porch like a furry dictator. "What about Oliver?" Karen's expression didn't even falter. "Oh, Oliver is grandfathered in. He's been here longer than the rule." Jake felt his blood pressure spike. "That's not how rules work." "Well, that's how our rules work." She smiled, tilting her head. "You understand, right? It's nothing personal. We just want to keep the neighborhood orderly." Jake could practically hear the unspoken words behind that statement. "We just want to control everything." He turned on his heel before he said something he'd regret, but he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That night, he pored over the HOA bylaws, trying to find any loophole, any clause that could keep Max in the neighborhood. He found nothing useful. The next morning, he attended the HOA meeting, determined to fight back. The meeting was held in the community center, a baize-walled room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and power trip. The long table at the front was occupied by the usual suspects. Karen, of course, sitting in the center like an empress, flanked by the other board members, most of whom either feared her or owed her favors. Jake didn't waste time. The moment they opened the floor to homeowner concerns, he stood up. "This dog ban is ridiculous." Karen barely glanced up from her stack of papers. "I'm sorry, but the board has already made its decision." "This isn't a decision, it's a dictatorship," Jake shot back. "There was no community vote. You're enforcing a rule that benefits you while punishing the rest of us." One of the board members, an older man named Greg, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It's not just Karen's decision, Jake. We discussed this at length. There have been complaints about large dogs." Jake folded his arms. "From who?" Silence. Karen smiled, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Let's not get caught up in specifics. The point is, the rule stands." Jake felt a rising tide of frustration. You can't just change the rules overnight. What about people who already have dogs? Max isn't harming anyone. We're giving you a grace period, Karen said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. A few weeks to make arrangements. I'm sure you can find a loving home for Max outside the community. Jake gritted his teeth. He looked around the room, searching for support, but most of the homeowners avoided his gaze. They were tired of fighting, worn down by years of Karen's nonsense. Some of them agreed with Jake, but they weren't willing to take on the battle themselves. With no other option, Jake had to make the most painful decision of his life. He called his brother, who lived outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and asked if Max could stay with him. It was only supposed to be temporary, but deep down, Jake knew that temporary could mean forever. The day he packed Max's things into his car, the dog's ears drooped in confusion. He licked Jake's face, whining softly as if sensing that something was wrong. When Jake pulled out of the driveway, Max pressed his nose against the window, watching him leave. The drive to his brother's house was the longest of Jake's life. He barely spoke as he handed over Max's leash, forcing a smile as his brother reassured him that Max would be well taken care of. The moment he got back home, his house felt empty. The silence was unbearable. He sat on the couch, staring at Max's empty dog bed, his anger simmering into something cold and sharp. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, an idea struck him. A loophole. A way to get back at Karen without breaking a single rule. He sat up, grabbing his laptop, and started researching. It was a long shot. It was ridiculous. But the more he read, the more he realized it could work. The HOA couldn't ban emotional support animals. And if they thought dealing with a golden retriever was a problem, they had no idea what was coming next. Jake sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through endless articles and legal documents about emotional support animals. The more he read, the more he realized how ironclad the protections were. The HOA had banned large dogs, but they hadn't banned emotional support animals. As long as an animal was officially registered and he had the paperwork to prove it, they couldn't do a thing about it. He smirked at the thought. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now it was his turn. At first, he considered getting another dog. A different breed, maybe a smaller one that technically didn't break their ridiculous weight limit. But the idea left a sour taste in his mouth. It wasn't just about keeping a pet. This was about principle. Karen had decided to play dictator, and she needed to learn that power went both ways. If he was going to make a statement, it had to be big. It had to be something she would never forget. He wasn't sure when the thought of an ostrich entered his mind. Maybe it was pure exhaustion, or maybe it was a desperate attempt to find something so absurd that even Karen wouldn't know how to react. He typed it into the search bar out of curiosity. Could an ostrich be an emotional support animal? The internet provided conflicting answers, but what stood out was that there were no official restrictions against it. If he could get the right paperwork, there was nothing the HOA could do. That thought alone was enough to send him down the rabbit hole. The more he researched, the more the idea grew on him. Ostriches were fast, territorial, and slightly terrifying. But they were also intelligent and oddly charming in their own way. They could live for decades, adapt to different environments, and, most importantly, were not on the HOA's list of banned pets. By the time he found a reputable breeder willing to sell him one, he was fully committed. Making the arrangements was easier than he expected. He found a specialist who handled exotic pet documentation and, with a few well-placed calls, managed to get the paperwork certifying the ostrich as an emotional support animal. The breeder, a man named Roy, didn't ask too many questions. He just explained the basics. Ostriches were social creatures, but they could also be stubborn and strong-willed. This was not going to be like owning a dog. Jake assured him he was ready, though deep down, he wasn't entirely sure. The day Kevin arrived, it was complete chaos. The transport truck pulled up in front of Jake's house, and immediately, people started coming outside to see what was going on. The driver, a burly man who looked like he had seen everything, barely reacted as he unloaded the massive bird. Kevin stepped out gracefully, blinking at his new surroundings. He was even bigger than Jake expected. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, he looked like he had walked straight out of prehistoric times. His long legs moved with an elegance that was both ridiculous and intimidating. Jake wasn't sure what to do at first. He had read all about ostrich care, but seeing Kevin in person was another thing entirely. The bird examined him with intelligent, beady eyes, then immediately pecked at Jake's car. The sound echoed through the neighborhood. People gasped. Karen, who had just stepped outside to check her mailbox, dropped her letters on the ground. "What the hell is that?" she shrieked, taking a step back. Jake smirked. "This is Kevin. He's my new emotional support animal." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That is not a support animal. That is a wild animal." Jake held up the official paperwork, enjoying the way her eyes twitched as she read it. "He's legally recognized. And according to HOA rules, emotional support animals are exempt from your pet restrictions." Karen snatched the papers, scanning them with barely contained fury. The other neighbors were whispering amongst themselves, some amused, others confused. A few kids had gathered, eyes wide with fascination. One of them whispered, "Is that a dinosaur?" Karen finally looked up, her voice sharp. "This is insane. You can't just bring a giant bird into the neighborhood." "Why not?" Jake asked, his tone innocent. "The HOA is all about following the rules, right? And according to the rules, Kevin is perfectly allowed." Her jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. She turned on her heel and stormed back inside, probably to call an emergency HOA meeting. Jake couldn't stop himself from grinning. He had won this round, and it felt good. Adjusting to life with Kevin, however, was another challenge. Ostriches were not exactly house pet. For one, Kevin had no respect for personal space. He followed Jake around the yard, pecking at anything shiny. He also had a habit of sprinting at full speed for no apparent reason, which nearly gave Jake a heart attack on multiple occasions. His neighbors were divided on whether Kevin was hilarious or terrifying. Some thought he was a menace. Others, especially the kids, thought he was the coolest thing they'd ever seen. Karen, of course, was not taking this well. Every day, she walked by with a sour expression, looking for any excuse to file a complaint. But there was nothing she could do. Kevin was registered, legal, and completely untouchable. That didn't mean she wasn't trying, though. The fines started coming in a few days later. They weren't directly about Kevin, but they were clearly targeted at Jake. Noise violations, improper landscaping, unapproved animal waste disposal. He even got a notice claiming his mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Jake kept every fine in a neat stack, planning his next move. Karen was desperate to break him, but he wasn't going down that easily. One evening, as Jake was feeding Kevin, his best friend Mike stopped by, laughing as he watched the bird strut around the yard. "I gotta admit, man," Mike said, shaking his head, "I thought you lost your mind, but this is genius." Jake chuckled. "I don't know if genius is the right word. I might be in way over my head." Mike watched as Kevin pecked at the fence, looking for something to steal. "So what's the plan?" "Karen's obviously not letting this go." Jake exhaled, looking toward Karen's house. "She wants to play dirty? Fine. But I'm not just going to sit back and take it. She's been bending the rules for years, getting away with whatever she wants. It's about time someone turned the tables." Mike smirked. "And how do you plan to do that?" Jake's grin was slow and dangerous. "By showing everyone that she's been breaking her own rules all along." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You got proof?" "Not yet," Jake admitted. "But give me a few days." As Mike left, Jake sat back in his chair, watching Kevin peck at the garden hose. He didn't just want to beat Karen. He wanted to expose her, to make sure that after this, she never had the power to pull another stunt like this again. And with Kevin by his side, He had just the distraction he needed to buy himself time. He had a feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. Life with Kevin quickly became an unpredictable adventure. Jake had thought he was prepared for what it meant to own an ostrich, but the reality was something else entirely. Kevin was a force of nature, a creature of chaos wrapped in feathers and long, powerful legs. He did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, with absolutely no regard for how ridiculous or inconvenient it was. And Jake loved every second of it. The neighborhood, however, was struggling to adjust. Every morning, Kevin would wake up at sunrise and announce his presence by making deep, guttural noises that sounded like a cross between a drumbeat and an alien war cry. The first time it happened, Jake had nearly fallen out of bed. By the second day, he was used to it. The neighbors, on the other hand, were not. Complaints started rolling in almost immediately, but Jake was ready for them. He had already checked local ordinances. There was no law against the sound an ostrich made, and Kevin was, after all, a registered emotional support animal. Karen had backed herself into a corner, and she knew it. She didn't waste any time coming after Jake in other ways. First, she tried intimidation. She started lingering outside his house, arms crossed, staring at Kevin like she could will him out of existence. Kevin, for his part, stared right back, blinking at her in slow, deliberate movements that seemed to unsettle her even more. One time, she even tried to scare him off by stomping her foot and making a shooing motion. Kevin responded by stretching out his long neck and letting out a deep, ominous hiss. Karen practically tripped over herself trying to back away. Then came the sabotage attempts. Jake started finding strange things tossed into his yard, small bits of trash, broken pieces of glass near Kevin's enclosure. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind it. Karen was getting desperate, but nothing she did seemed to shake Kevin's confidence. If anything, the ostrich seemed to thrive on the attention. He strutted around the neighborhood like he owned the place, pecking at mailboxes, inspecting people's lawns, and occasionally bolting at full speed down the sidewalk just to remind everyone how fast he was. The other HOA board members were starting to crack under the pressure. At one of their emergency meetings, Greg, the same board member who had meekly supported Karen during the dog ban, finally spoke up. "Look, Karen," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "We need to let this go. The bird is legal. We can't keep making rules just because you don't like something." Karen slammed her hand on the table, causing a few people to jump. "That thing is a menace. It runs around like a lunatic, makes horrible noises, and terrifies the children." One of the other board members hesitated. "My son actually loves the ostrich." Karen shot him a glare so sharp he immediately shut up. "This isn't a joke," she seethed. "We need to take action before this gets out of control." Jake, sitting in the back of the room, couldn't resist. "Define out of control, Karen. Are you afraid Kevin's going to overthrow the HOA and declare himself supreme leader? Because honestly, I'd vote for him." A few people snickered, but Karen was beyond humor at this point. She turned to the board members. "We need a vote. We need to ban exotic animals from the neighborhood immediately." Greg sighed. "We can't do that without an official process, Karen. And even if we could, you'd have to prove Kevin is actually causing harm." Karen looked like she was about to explode. "This is why people hate HOAs," she muttered under her breath, but she knew she was trapped. Over the next few days, she tried a new tactic, building a case against Kevin through a series of exaggerated complaints. She started filing reports, claiming the ostrich was a public safety threat, that he had chased a small child, and that he was disturbing the peace. Jake knew she was lying, but he also knew Karen had a habit of bending the truth just enough to make things difficult. Then, one morning, Jake woke up to find a city animal control officer standing on his porch. The man looked professional, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression that was more exhausted than authoritative. "Mr. Parker?" he asked, flipping through his notes. "We received multiple complaints about an aggressive exotic animal on your property." Jake glanced over at Kevin, who was currently trying to fit an entire garden hose in his beak. He gestured toward the bird. That's him. The officer blinked. That's the aggressive animal? Jake nodded. Yep. The terrifying, dangerous beast. The officer stared at Kevin for a long moment. Kevin stared back. After a beat, Kevin let the hose drop from his mouth and proceeded to sit down in the most unimpressive way possible. The officer sighed. Look, I don't want to waste your time. I just need to verify that he's not actually a threat. Jake handed over the paperwork, showing that Kevin was registered and fully legal. The officer skimmed through it, nodding. Well, everything seems to be in order. Karen, who had been watching from her driveway, stormed over. Are you kidding me? She snapped. This thing is out of control. It's been terrorizing the neighborhood. The officer looked at her, then looked at Kevin again, who was now very focused on pecking at a stray shoelace in the grass. Ma'am, he said, rubbing his forehead, I don't think this ostrich is terrorizing anyone. Karen's face turned red. He's a public nuisance. Look at him. He's plotting something. The officer exchanged a glance with Jake. Well, I don't see any reason to remove him, he said, handing the papers back. As long as he's properly taken care of and not actually causing harm, there's nothing we can do. Karen made a strangled noise in the back of her throat. So that's it? That's all you're going to do? Just let this monster run loose. The officer sighed again. Ma'am, it's an ostrich, not a grizzly bear. Karen turned on Jake, fury in her eyes. You think you've won? She hissed. This isn't over. Jake smiled. Oh, I know it's not over, but I'm really enjoying watching you lose. Karen stormed away, and the officer gave Jake a small nod before leaving. The moment the door shut, Jake turned to Kevin, who was now inspecting his own shadow like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Well, buddy, Jake said, patting his feathered friend on the side, I think we just made things a lot worse for Karen. Kevin made a satisfied noise and strutted off to steal another garden hose. That night, Jake sat on his porch, watching the sunset, feeling a strange sense of peace despite the chaos. Karen wasn't going to give up, but neither was he. And the best part? He wasn't just fighting back, he was winning. He sipped his drink, leaned back, and smiled to himself. This was far from over. And he couldn't wait to see what happened next. Jake knew Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. If anything, being humiliated in front of the HOA and the animal control officer had only fueled her determination to take him down. He had seen the look in her eyes when she stormed away, the barely contained fury simmering beneath her forced smile. She wasn't just angry, she was planning something. And Jake wasn't going to sit around waiting for her next move. He spent the next few nights doing something he should have done a long time ago, digging into Karen's history with the HOA. He had a gut feeling that she had been bending the rules for years, getting away with things simply because no one had ever dared to challenge her. Most people in the neighborhood had either been too afraid or too indifferent to look deeper. But now that she had declared war on him, Jake had every reason to find out exactly how deep her hypocrisy ran. The first thing he did was go through the HOA record. It took some effort, most of the files weren't exactly public, but he knew a few people on the board who weren't particularly loyal to Karen. After some friendly persuasion, he managed to get access to the financial reports and past rule changes. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Karen had been conveniently altering regulations for years, always justifying them as being in the best interest of the community. Yet, whenever a rule didn't suit her personally, she found ways to work around it. He found out that Karen's massive backyard shed, which she always insisted was part of her original property design, was actually an unapproved structure that had never been officially permitted. There were records of complaints about it from years ago, but every single one had been mysteriously dismissed. On top of that, she had made modifications to her house, things like additional fencing and decorative alterations, that were in direct violation of HOA regulations. If anyone else had done the same, she would have fined them into oblivion. The more Jake uncovered, the more he realized how deep her manipulation went. The HOA wasn't just a homeowners association under her leadership. It was a tool for her personal control. She had been selectively enforcing rules, allowing her friends to get away with violations while cracking down on anyone she didn't like. If someone spoke out against her, they suddenly found themselves hit with nonsense violations, the same way Jake had been. She had been running a dictatorship disguised as a community organization. Armed with this knowledge, Jake started gathering evidence. He took pictures of her unapproved modifications, collected copies of past complaints, and even found old meeting notes where Karen had pushed through rule changes that conveniently benefited her while punishing others. The more he collected, the more confident he became. If Karen wanted to play dirty, then he was going to make sure she got buried under her own rulebook. The next step was getting the neighborhood on his side. He knew that while many of them disliked Karen, they also feared her. She had been in control for so long that most people assumed fighting her was pointless. But Jake had something no one else had ever possessed: proof. He started talking to his neighbors, subtly bringing up the fact that Karen had been breaking her own rules while holding everyone else to impossibly high standard. At first, they were skeptical, but once he showed them the documentation, their frustration turned into something more powerful: anger. One by one, people started coming forward with their own stories. A retired couple down the street revealed that Karen had fined them for having a potted plant that was too colorful for the neighborhood's aesthetic. A single mother admitted that Karen had forced her to repaint her entire front door because the shade of blue wasn't approved, even though Karen had changed her own trim without approval. There were dozens of these stories. People who had been bullied, harassed, and forced to comply with Karen's ridiculous demands while she did whatever she wanted. Jake knew the time was right to strike. He waited until the next HOA meeting, which had been called specifically to discuss ongoing disturbances in the neighborhood. He had no doubt that Karen had planned to use it as another attempt to get rid of Kevin, but this time, she wasn't the one in control. The meeting was packed. More residents had shown up than usual, likely because word had spread that something big was about to happen. Karen sat at the front of the room, her expression tight but confident. She still thought she had the upper hand. The moment she began speaking, Jake stood up. "Before we discuss whatever complaints Karen has prepared," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "I think we need to talk about something else first." Karen frowned. "Jake, this isn't the time." "No," he interrupted. "This is exactly the time. Because for years, you've been enforcing rules on everyone else while breaking them yourself." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous," she said, laughing nervously. "I've done nothing of the sort." Jake pulled out a folder and began laying out the evidence. One by one, he went through every rule Karen had broken, every unfair fine she had issued, every time she had twisted the HOA regulations for her own benefit. He presented the photos of her unapproved shed, the modifications to her house, the past complaints that had been dismissed under her authority. With every new revelation, the room's energy shifted. People weren't just listening, they were getting angry. Karen's confidence started to crack. This is absurd," she stammered. "Those were all approved exceptions. I have documentation." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Then why isn't there a single official record of them? Why do you get exceptions when no one else does?" He turned to the board members. "Have any of you ever approved special exemptions for Karen?" The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's face turned red. She looked at the board, at the neighbors, at Jake, realizing too late that she was losing control. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped. "I have done everything for this neighborhood. I have worked tirelessly to keep this community in order." A man from the back interrupted. "No, you've worked tirelessly to control us." Another woman stood up. "Yeah, and we're sick of it." The momentum shifted completely. People started voicing their frustrations, one after another, years of pent-up resentment finally spilling out. The HOA board members, clearly shaken, exchanged nervous glances. Greg cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Maybe it's time for a leadership change." Karen paled. "You can't do this." Jake smiled. "Actually, according to HOA bylaws, we can." He pulled out another document. "There's a clause that allows for an emergency vote of no confidence if enough homeowners petition for it. And guess what? We have more than enough signatures." Karen's hands clenched into fists. "You'll regret this." "No, Karen," Jake said, leaning back with satisfaction. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The vote was taken right then and there. It wasn't even close. Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and stormed out without another word. The room erupted in cheers. For the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt free. Jake exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He looked over at Kevin, who had somehow managed to sneak his head through the window, watching the chaos unfold with his usual blank expression. Jake grinned. "Looks like we won, buddy." Kevin blinked slowly, then let out a deep, satisfied grunt. For the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt free. Karen's downfall should have been the end of the chaos, but Jake knew better than to assume she would go quietly. The night after the vote, the neighborhood was buzzing with energy. People were celebrating in their own ways, some gathering in small groups, others just enjoying the relief of knowing they wouldn't wake up to another absurd HOA violation. Jake sat on his porch with a beer in hand, watching Kevin strut around the yard like he had personally orchestrated Karen's demise. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., a loud banging on Jake's door shattered the calm. He groggily stumbled out of bed, half expecting it to be another ridiculous HOA fine slipped under his door, only to find two police officers standing there. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted in satisfaction. One of the officers cleared his throat and glanced at his notepad. "Mr. Parker, we received a report of an exotic animal causing a public disturbance," the officer said, barely suppressing a sigh. Jake blinked the sleep out of his eyes. "You mean Kevin?" He pointed toward the ostrich, who was sleeping peacefully in the yard, his long neck stretched out awkwardly across the grass. Karen stepped forward. "That thing is a danger to the community. He's aggressive, he's running loose, he's scaring people." The second officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we'll handle it." Jake crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Do you see him running loose? Because last time I checked, he was literally asleep." The first officer nodded, looking unimpressed with Karen's theatrics. "Sir, we do have to follow up on complaint. Do you have documentation proving he's a legal emotional support animal?" Jake grabbed the folder from inside, handing it over. The officer skimmed through the paperwork, nodded, and handed it back. "Everything looks in order." He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, unless you have actual evidence of a problem, there's nothing we can do." Karen's face twisted in fury. "You're just going to let this go?" The officer sighed. "We can't remove an animal just because you don't like it." Karen let out an almost inhuman noise before stomping away, muttering under her breath. The officers gave Jake an apologetic nod before leaving. He shut the door, shaking his head. By morning, the entire neighborhood knew about Karen's failed attempt to call the cops on Kevin. It had been posted on the community Facebook group, and people were having a field day with it. Memes were being made. Someone edited a picture of Kevin wearing sunglasses with the caption, "Still standing." The more Karen fought, the more the neighborhood turned against her. Jake thought she might finally give up, but then she tried her most desperate move yet. She filed a formal lawsuit against him, claiming Kevin was a threat to the safety and moral integrity of the community. That was when Jake realized she had completely lost it. He wasn't worried, though. He had a solid case, and Karen was relying on emotion rather than fact. The court date was set, and by the time they walked into the small county courtroom, the entire situation had turned into a local spectacle. A few reporters even showed up. Karen showed up with a stack of papers and a PowerPoint presentation. She spent nearly 20 minutes ranting about how Kevin was an agent of chaos and how she had been persecuted for trying to protect the neighborhood. She even pulled out a slideshow of blurry photos of Kevin pecking at things, dramatically pointing out how unpredictable he was. The judge looked like he was trying not to roll his eyes. When it was Jake's turn, he kept it simple. He presented Kevin's official registration as an emotional support animal, documented Karen's personal vendetta against him, and even brought in testimonies from neighbors who had no issue with Kevin. The judge didn't even take long to decide. The lawsuit was dismissed. Karen was ordered to pay all legal fees. When they walked out of the courthouse, Jake could feel the rage radiating off of her. She turned to him, her voice low and venomous. "You might have won this time, but you'll regret this." Jake just smiled. "I already don't." With Karen defeated on every front, the neighborhood finally started to change. The HOA, now under new leadership, started focusing on things that actually mattered, like fixing the community park and updating the pool instead of policing mailbox colors. People felt freer. There was laughter in the air instead of tension. It was like someone had finally lifted a years-long weight off everyone's shoulders. And Kevin? Kevin was thriving. The neighborhood kids adored him, bringing him treats and taking pictures with him. Someone even suggested making him the official community mascot, and before Jake knew it, there was a vote on it. Kevin won by an overwhelming majority. A few weeks after everything settled down, Jake threw a massive neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the end of the Karen era. Almost everyone showed up, even people who had never been involved in HOA meetings before. People brought food, drinks, and a massive cake that had a cartoon ostrich drawn on top with the words, "Long live Kevin." The atmosphere was different now, lighter, happier. As the sun started to set, Jake sat back, watching the scene in front of him. People laughing, kids running around, music playing in the background. He had never felt more at home in this neighborhood than he did now. Then, as if on cue, Max came sprinting toward him. His brother had finally moved into a house outside the HOA, meaning Max was back home where he belonged. Jake knelt down, scratching his fur as the golden retriever happily wagged his tail. Kevin, not one to be ignored, strutted over and nudged Max with his beak. Max barked once, then ran off, Kevin immediately chasing after him. They raced around the yard, dodging people, knocking over lawn chairs, causing the kind of hilarious chaos that only a golden retriever and an ostrich could create. Mike, watching the whole thing with a beer in hand, shook his head. "You know, this all started because you just wanted to keep your dog." Jake grinned. "Yeah, and now I have an ostrich, a mascot, and a Karen-free neighborhood. I'd say it worked out pretty well." Mike laughed. "You're never going to have a normal life, are you?" Jake took a sip of his drink, watching Kevin and Max wreak havoc with zero regret. "Nope. And I wouldn't have it any other way."